Well, hello there. Guess who? It's
Me, Mario!
No, my name is Carrie, and today we're entering the halfway mark. I got mine finished, you got yours finished, and they are looking rad. We got a lot of ground to cover this chapter, so I'll give you a little rundown of what I did, and you can laugh and point and feel superior as usual.
Bullying is unfair.
Just kidding, I nailed it this time.
So that is why I am better than everyone in the world. Kiss my ass and suck my
I mean, you know, I didn't start out nailing it. I may have started out a little rough. Or pretty rough. Yeah, really, really rough. Alright, cards on the table. I should probably crawl in a hole and die. We set out to make some things by hand, and started out with just a simple warm-up. Hopefully you were able to dive right into it. If not, I feel ya. I came up with about a dozen reasons to keep putting it off, just out of apprehension and uncertainty. But I did it, and when I finally sat down and did the warm-up with pen and paper, I decided once a couple of pages were filled up and I wasn't so stiff to just move right into making elements. If you did the same, you may have noticed just how tight your hands probably still are, even after a short warm-up. Warm-up really just gets the wheels rolling, but they ain't rolling smooth necessarily. You'll keep warming up as you make. Maybe you can see how true that is for me here. I grabbed this calligraphy pen I never use and just tried to see what kinds of lines and textures I could get out of it. Just pulling it different ways, pressing harder or softer, loading the tip with ink versus running it dry. Ideally, you get a little creative with how you use the tools because you're just experimenting at this point. You're playing. You're basically doing research, trying to see if there's anything you like and how to improve on it. And it's best that you're doing it before you watch me do it each time, so you're really exploring your own territory. You can always return to it afterward if there's something you see here that gets you going. Like, I got these little spatter elements just through dabbing at the paper and letting the ink bleed out a little bit. I also dipped a soft, thin brush in ink and just worked on getting some brushy lines. And when I ran out of space and did something as simple as going horizontal with the strokes instead, I got a few that seemed like they might already be good for something. And then I proceeded to make more garbage. Just tried wetting the paper to get some inky bleeds here, but they weren't that great. But decided to stick with that brush and ink combo for a bit, just figuring stuff out, letting the brush progressively dry out or adding ink in layers. And then finally, I stopped pussyfooting around and really loaded the brush up with ink and laid it down. And pretty much instantly, this happened, which just in a raw form is really nice, right? Then I tried some other gestures and went ahead and scanned all this stuff in. Admittedly, jumped the gun there quite a bit. This couldn't have been more than 30 minutes of trying things with just a calligraphy pen and a brush with a bottle of old-ass ink. And the marks themselves are fairly small, so the detail I got out of them, even with relatively high-res scanning, it's not all that amazing. But, lessons gotta be learned. So to start out, I was just pushing around some values with subtle color shifts. And I'd had my eye on this particular brush stroke just to see what might come of it. And of course, I'm miraculously surprised when it doesn't immediately rock my world. So maybe more is better? More lines? That's good logic, right? Yes, that is definitely exciting. You know what's also exciting? Circles. Because they're not triangles. Yes. Oh, and gradients? Delicious. And, looking at it now, there may have been something in this minimal combo that might have worked. But at the time, I was just in bulldozer mode, thinking about using the crap out of these elements, as if that would somehow prove to myself that I could do it. So hey, let's pile in some more garbage. Let's make a mess for no particular reason. Playing, but not really with any self-made rules in mind. Not good play. It's exploration, but without the benefit of boundaries, so there's no structure to explore within and really no challenge to work with. A basic boundary or super simple rule set that would have helped would have been to simply pay attention to how the basic contrasts play out with these new elements. That's not a great structure if you want to be really productive, but in the absence of anything else, even something that basic is usually better than flopping around like a fish in a bucket. I mean, look at this flopping. So graceful. white, black, I don't know. What about here? How about there? You know, it's a little painful to watch this kind of directionless floundering. But warming up your hands to draw or make simple marks is really different than warming up to make actual compositions. And having moved right from scanning to this, yeah, you see what I'm getting at. I'm not really in gear yet. To be fair, there is an attempt here to start using these big brush strokes to indicate some movement. At the very least, using that rule or guideline. Staying within the guideline of use these to make movement. And while it's not much, it's better than nothing. And then layering them in front of and behind the circle starts to create just the littlest bit of depth. So to turn it into slightly more productive play, maybe we focus a little on generating depth. Building in some contrast and value to highlight the silhouettes of these foreground shapes can be as easy as painting in those values, but maybe we can bring in those values while also introducing a contrast in scale and density with like a ton of tiny circles. And building them out to roughly complement the movement that's already indicated, and sampling the same colors as the big circle to tie them together. And that is some weak ass sauce. But that's how it goes when you're not really in gear yet, especially when you're also making arbitrary decisions because they aren't really guided by goals, boundaries, or much of a structure. Without any of that, you're typically just throwing stuff around to see if it sticks. Not even sure why you want anything stuck to anything else in particular in the first place. But maybe the act of blindly throwing stuff helps you warm up in some small way. In other words, it's not necessarily a completely wasted effort. It's just not immediately satisfying. It won't look like instant success. So really, I'm just blindly layering up elements to push that depth, just hoping some magic happens. Even trying to round out these circles into spheres with some fake specular highlighting, courtesy of more handmade elements, as if that would make a difference at this point. And maybe you need 30 minutes to finally get to the point where you at least recognize your own flopping around for what it is. Maybe it's just a warm-up. Again, it's not wasted time, but it can be frustrating time. Even when you are warmed up, there are going to be frustrations. Remember that you're going to go through that sometimes. We all are. It's built into us. It's part of how we function. As a creative person, you're naturally going to venture into uncharted territory, into the unknown. So you're naturally going to feel that doubting, that frustration, that let's not do this struggle sometimes. It's just part of the effort for anyone trying to do anything worthwhile. The point is, don't get on yourself about it. Just know that's what it is. Let your brain do it and move through it by resorting to a solid play mindset. Relax, give yourself a good structure or boundaries to work within, and let yourself explore that space without consequence. And it's totally fair to whip out a fresh sheet instead of trying to clean up an embarrassing mess. I thoroughly embarrassed myself here, so I moved on to number 2 with a clean slate and a more goal-oriented decision to make something minimalist. Even more specifically, giving myself the constraint of finding a simple way to combo a handmade element with a digital element and as little else as possible. Which isn't a brilliantly interesting constraint to start with, but it sets some boundaries, so it's way better than what I was doing. And what came out of it was this. And honestly, I kind of love it. It is by no means earth-shattering, but the contrast or juxtaposition of the perfectly sharp lines and smooth surfaces of the square and background versus the broken lines and rough texture of the brushstroke and masked out ink bleed, it works really well. Digital versus handmade. It's got a hint of depth, tiny bit of movement. It's got a bunch of things going for it just as it is. And again, it's hard to judge these things concretely because there's really no greater design purpose it's trying to fulfill. So we can't say how well it's doing that, but we can say formally it works for various reasons. Granted, it does resemble some really basic ass dentist office wall art from the early 90s, but it is done with a more modern touch, and sometimes modernizing a cliche can actually turn out pretty cool. I might be trying to sell this one a little too hard, but it's fun because I don't think I've made anything like this before. And of course, even though that simple combo of smooth color versus texture and clean edge versus broken seems to work really nicely, it's not a reason not to look at what you can do with other types of contrast as well. I wanted to keep the color palette simple, but figured there was plenty to be done with value. So I chose this medium gray background, but gave it some variation in value, and gave the square a lot of variation in value, and made sure it very much contrasted with that background. Even gave it a tiny bevel to get the bottom edge a little darker and the top edge a little brighter. Set the white brushstroke off with a light drop shadow, which helps it stand out and also just gives it a touch of depth, and painted in what looks like a foreshortened shadow, which makes it look like there's a floor, so the whole thing isn't floating in a vacuum. There's even some painted in reflected light from the white of the brushstroke and the purple of the ink wash. And then there's a faint glow or something painted in up here, although really that brighter value brings the background value closer to the value at the top of the square. So it's actually decreasing the contrast along that edge. But it's not a huge effect. I could take it or leave it. I'd probably dump it if I did it again, but I won't hide my shame from you. Despite liking this one, I did feel like it was almost too easy. So of course, next I went a totally different and more complicated direction and did this, stretching squares every which way. Now this was all laid out in Illustrator over a few hours and then dropped into Photoshop where some color and lighting was painted in. And some of these brush strokes and spatters were lined up with all of it. Obviously this one's visually busier than the last, and density is a little more of a concern so that it doesn't become an overcomplicated smear of stuff. Density is important here too, but it's a lot easier to manage with so few elements. Everything's focused right here and focused even slightly more so in this smaller area. But here, there are just so many more elements. It takes some real balancing to create areas of density and not so density. And I aim to make that true at every level of zoom, really. Pulled all the way back, the contrast in density between this area and this area is pretty high, right? And the contrast in scales is supporting that. There are a lot of small scale elements packed into this space and relatively fewer large scale elements in this space. High density, small scale. Low density, large scale. But for this to work the best, it's great if that's also true at other levels of zoom. For example, over here, clearly this area is denser relative to this area, or relative to this. And the relative scales are kind of apparent. Even if you take a simple section like this, there's not an even smear of elements. Again, in relative terms, most of the action is packed over here. Same is true here at this level, and at this level. If this at all reminds you of fractals or of why the golden ratio is nice, you're probably onto something. But simply put, scale and density are closely related. They're not synonymous, but it's pretty easy to work with both at the same time. If you've got an even smear of stuff and you push some of it together, what do you get? Big stuff versus small stuff. High density versus low. In this example, it's intentionally ambiguous which shapes are positive space and which are negative. Do you see the dark squares or the bright lines? Well, actually, they're both important to the eye. Now, the lines didn't change in scale when we squeezed them together. They got more dense. But the relative scales of the squares did change. Increasing scale or density, you kind of inherently get contrasts in scale and density. And then maybe you get a pizza party. I don't know, whatever you want. It's okay to treat yourself. So that was a rule I tried to adhere to and play within while building this out. Trying to create contrast in density and scale, no matter how you crop it or where you look. When we zoom all the way back out, maybe you can see a little better how that plays out in different ways at different levels, and where it's succeeding and maybe not succeeding so much. This was an attempt at really playing with that idea, but in general, it can be really helpful to think about how the basic contrasts play out at different levels of zoom, from the whole frame down to little bits and pieces. Although it does mean managing lots of things at once. and all the while thinking of the whole even while working on a small patch of it. Density and scale can both be really intricate challenges if you want to tackle them. Balancing out how much of any given contrast to use in general can be an interesting puzzle, and the result of figuring out those little puzzles can be really beautiful. Let's also have a quick tangent about our sixth and final dimension of basic contrast. Direction describes the orientation or direction of the individual elements involved. This doesn't seem to have a direction, but this kind of does, and to some degree, so does this. Now this does for sure, right? In this case, scale and value are helping to indicate direction. Scale and value are pretty useful here, but any way you can indicate a line or orient something or differentiate one end of an element from another will start to convey direction. So any or all of these dimensions in combination can help define and strengthen the direction of an element, or of groups of elements. Changes in scale across multiple shapes here are generating some direction, possibly lots of directions, depending on the context and how you see it. And that's pretty useful for directing attention or even doing basic stuff like contrasting or differentiating similar elements from one another, or setting up movement. So how is direction different from movement? Well, it's not a super critical distinction to make, and there's definitely some gray area, but we think of direction as a quality of some elements that can be contrasted with other elements or sets of elements. Whereas movement really speaks more to how the eye is being guided around the entire composition, the sum total. Where you have elements with coordinated direction, you're probably affecting the overall compositional movement because direction is one more way of suggesting to the eye which way it should go. Having gone through them all now, hopefully it's clearer how each of these primary dimensions are qualities we can see contrasted between elements or even within a single element. And that we certainly can talk about these higher level qualities when looking at small groups of elements, but they're really more useful when thinking about the composition as a whole. And I mean useful in that none of these are rules to be followed. Like you can talk about depth on the very small scale when comparing two individual elements. It can even exist within a single element. And the reverse is true. You can easily talk about density as a global quality as it pertains to the overall composition. The way this framework is set up is as a really good foundation for thinking about how things relate to each other on a formal level and how that informs the composition. So if you see parts of other frameworks you want to incorporate, or it makes more sense to you to scoot these things around a bit, that's totally fine. Primary, secondary, whatever-ary. The value of this whole strategy is that it gives you the power to see, in concrete terms, what's really going on visually. Getting really good at seeing these things is like laser vision. You can easily figure out how and why your imagery is succeeding or falling flat, and then more easily figure out how to make it better. Obviously, there's strong movement from here to here because several things are reinforcing it. The direction of these lines converging down here, and the shapes they make while they're at it, which are generally decreasing in scale, all toward an area of relatively much denser activity. All of that really draws the eye. Plus the more unique elements of these bright sort of glowing lines also pointing to the same area. All these individual things are indicating direction and collectively create overall movement. And an example like this is kind of straightforward to make. It just takes laying it out relatively early on so that you have a target to aim for as you use the various contrasts to continue building it out. For something illustrated like this, trying to shift around where it's dense and where it's not, or edit some coherent movement into existence later by changing the hundreds of elements you've laid down already is kind of a pain. So knowing to consider things like movement and density right from the start is huge. Also, once you figure out what you're generally trying to do, of course you try to build it smartly so those pains don't become total nightmares. I built most of this in Illustrator, not only because it's easier to draw squares that way, but also because I can paste the result into Photoshop as a smart object and then skew it into perspective. And then if I want to change the drawing, I just open up the smart object and edit the unskewed version, which is about 1,000,000 times easier. It's actually 972,000 times easier, but I'm rounding up. So there's plenty of work to do here, but some of that work is actually in simply planning ahead to prevent it from becoming an unclimbable mountain of trash. So this strong overall movement is pre-planned, but I tend to think it would be kind of boring if everything were pointing the same way. So this 90-degree contrast in direction is introduced here with some vertical shapes. And then throwing the whole thing into perspective, those shapes go diving across the frame at more dynamic angles. And that seems to work pretty well. Now the color scheme is fairly simple, so that's not a lot to manage. It's pretty close to straight up black and white, aside from these lighter gray panels to break that up a bit, with these purple and yellow accents. There's some slight shifts in the purples though, just to keep it from being a completely flat color. I tend to introduce minor hue variations into colors like this just by painting a single color and then painting in an additional really closely related color. Because colors in reality are never perfectly uniform like they are in apps like this. It's one of those things that's subtle, but you don't get it by default. And if it's not there, it just doesn't feel quite right, feels a little less than. Unless you're trying specifically to make something look flat or generated or perfect or uniform. So clearly both of these are very different, but they still draw from the same set of basic contrasts, even if they're each more focused on specific subsets of those contrasts. This one is really driven by the contrast in values, textures, and line quality, whereas textural contrast isn't playing a very significant role here. This is more reliant on value, scale, direction, and generating overall movement as a result. The value contrasts in particular are really high, with these darks framed in by all these sharp whites. Whereas in this one, the value contrast is high enough, but it's certainly not absolute blacks and pure whites. Contrast in depth here is also pretty subtle, and it's only apparent because the square is in front of the background and the brush stroke is in front of the square, and there are hints of shadow in between, and also indicating a floor in perspective. Now this one's utilizing a little bit of stacking for foreground background, but mostly perspective to indicate depth and draw the eye to a focal point. But you could keep pushing the depth if you wanted to. The simplest example might be to use blurring to imply depth of field, and maybe paint in some heavier atmosphere in the distance, which I did by layering up that ink wash texture to act like a fog. Of course, atmosphere and focal blurring are things you might start to see when looking through a camera lens when foreground and background are really far apart and distinct. So referencing those things helps suggest some depth. You do lose a bit of detail from blurring and fogging, but of course you gain some textural contrast by introducing the soft blurry shapes in the context of the original hard edges. And you're always kind of looking to balance those compromises out so you come out on top. You could add a bunch of elements in the foreground stacked on top of each other, progressively blurred in keeping with the existing depth of field, layers of color or light in between those, maybe particulate. There are lots of little ways the eye determines what's in front and what's in back and how far things are from each other. And you can use as many or as few indications as you like if they're appropriate. We're covering up more of the original composition, but I think it's adding some dynamism as a trade-off. And again, you can go crazy with this stuff, but in the end, balancing out the effect of all these things is critical. You can keep adding wheels to a car to make it roll better, but at some point, more wheels starts making it roll worse. For example, I felt like there were just too many focal points at this stage. There were so many points of light, the hierarchy was a little mushy. I was really losing out on value contrasts. So I knocked out this bright stuff on the left and toned down the lighting on the right since it wouldn't need to compete as much, and then added some of these splatters for a kind of particle effect to increase the density and even create some textural contrast to the rest of the frame. So now the depth and perspective are really working together to lead the eye to an area that's actually a little more interesting in the end. And with all that light no longer flooding the frame, it made it much easier to create this recessed area in shadow. If you've got a light in front of a shadow, it's pretty hard to see that shadow. So this wasn't really an option before. And not only does it make more use of that contrast in direction that was built into the original illustration, but it's also furthering the suggestion of depth. So this one is really using a wide range of contrasts. The textural contrast between blurry and rigid, value contrasts of light against dark, both in the details and across the entire frame, elements suggesting direction and other elements breaking that direction, scale contrasts indicating near and far, in addition to the values and perspective and everything adding up to create variations in depth, as well as overall movement. Although to be fair, this doesn't make much use of the handmade elements, and where it does, it's really disguised. And not that disguising them is a bad strategy, but I was just really interested to keep exploring the minimalistic detail versus handmade thing. So I basically went back to my scans and found an element that I wanted to start with, more as a focus. And I think for the same reasons that this felt like a 90s reference, this mark all by itself seemed primed for something similarly nostalgic, or at least I thought so. So I went at it, and I made this. Pretty similar strategy leading to a sort of similar result in a way, just maybe a step up in complexity. Also a step up in cheesiness, but who doesn't like a little bit of that cheese? It's also taking a lot from this from last round, but gains a lot from actual texture. And there are a few different textures going on here, so this whole dimension of contrast can really come into play. Brushstroke roughness, plus tiny bits from this splatter, versus the smoothness of the airbrush stuff and these clean edges and the pattern created with these thin lines. Even a kind of middle ground with this really subtle, rougher surface here, which is just that ink bleed showing up again for a touch of grit and randomness. But I think what's really fun about this is in realizing just how easy it is to make a really interesting element by hand. That just warming up for a bit and whipping a brush back and forth like you're signing an autograph can make something inherently nice to look at, and that highlighting that results in nice stuff. It's really the theory of the happy accident coming into play, right? Usable stuff is all around us, but the happy accident happens when you're paying enough attention to realize that something unintended or generally unnoticed is potentially great. To 99.5% of people, this is a page full of mistakes and chicken scratch. It's waste paper that needs to make its way to the garbage can. But if you're paying attention and you're engaging things around you with open eyes, you're bound to see what most people never will. That's probably a bit much to say while staring at a brushstroke, but then remember this? It's practically a crayon scribble, and it became a visual icon of the 1990s. This was everywhere. I'm pretty sure this would have been scrubbed down with bleach by almost anyone until an artist stood up and said, "No, look here, I meant to do this, and it's pretty great." That's my version of art history, by the way. Sophisticated, I know. But looking at it this way, as a learned skill for finding or making random stuff and then understanding it in these terms so you know how it might be useful or how you might make it useful, it's easier to see how you get from useless trash to here. By which I mean you sit at a desk making trash marks and then you get to make a video for a rap star. It's so simple. But this is really just effective use of the same stuff that we're making, combined in specific ways for reasons you can very much identify now. Pen marks, brush strokes, torn edges, and it's put together intentionally to make this frenetic, damaged, irreverent, and sort of aggressive tone. Now clearly it's a long way from this to superstars, but as with most things, we'll get there in small steps by iterating and building up a library of stuff that works. Having played around and learned some things that worked for me, like how these simple combos of textural versus clean work so well, it seemed like stripping down all these crammed in elements might be a good idea. Uncomplicate things. Really focus on some core moments of contrast. Let's make sure the line qualities read well. If there are just a few elements, let's really pay attention to their scales relative to each other. Let's let tiny things be really tiny and big things be really big. Let's pay attention to how one thing leads to another to create movement. And let's reinforce that movement once we find it, through scale, through value, from small to big and bright to dark. Can we make the brights more punctuated? Can we go darker elsewhere? Can we contrast the scales even more dramatically? Yeah, well, yeah, that's pretty dramatic. It maintains the movement and it has the advantage of highlighting some depth. But can we get more depth? Yeah, just by putting one thing in front of the other. And making that big move changes things a little, like how the values balance out. But a little exploring can help that come back together. Anytime you make a big move, you're going to have to reassess what was working before because it's probably changed. So stepping back to look at each bit in terms of the various dimensions of contrast at play is super helpful. Something I also find helpful sometimes when I think I'm just not seeing it with a fresh eye anymore is to flip the whole thing horizontally or vertically. In most cases, when you're making more meaningful imagery, you're not actually going to keep it that way. But it really helps to see it from a different angle. Maybe you can see where you need to adjust some values or the scale of something or its position. Maybe it gives you new ideas to get you unstuck from the same repetitive thinking. Maybe some strategy that worked really well at the start just isn't working so well after a big change, and you just don't spot it until you look at it from a new perspective. I thought the movement had died out a little with all of the fudging around, and I wanted to block out the major shapes a little more definitively. For example, can this open space be more of a shape with distinct direction instead of just open space? Yeah, it just needs to be defined a little better, carved out by the other shapes. And it just so happens that for me, that one move kind of helps it all fall together. So now if you take a step back, it's easier to see that this wedge of light is the most dominant shape, and it flows from here to here, creating some movement. And the most apparent lines in the frame are modulated so they indicate direction, and those directions accentuate or echo that same movement. What's more, there's a bit of a flow from our textural line into the edge of the background sphere. Kind of a cumulative direction that supports that general movement. But what's kind of cool is that because we've got these scale contrasts across the black circles, there's this kind of counterpoint movement across here because that scale contrast is subtly pulling the eye from one shape to the next. So despite the minimal number of elements, there's kind of a lot of movement. There's depth from the stacking of elements too, and the original goal of juxtaposing textural with clean is working along with the distinct hue and value contrast to really make our handmade element pop, even though it's so thin. All in all, it's working pretty well. I mean, let's not forget, yeah, it's a little better, right? Celebrate your victories. Now, this does use a handmade element in a focal way, but it's still mostly relying on digital elements like these others, which is cool, but I had wanted to try using this stuff in a more pervasive way, just to try it. And what I had here didn't seem to be enough to get me there. I jumped the gun a little bit. So I got out a much bigger brush and some acrylic paint and made a whole new set of elements to try out. Look at all that raw material. And what came out of working with that raw material is this, which is definitely using a ton of handmade elements, but I am not feeling it at all. Mostly because it sucks. It's gross and drippy, but at the same time, the tone is bright and contrasty. This just has no idea what it's trying to be. To me, it seems like a bad mix of unconsidered stuff, which it is. So let's get rid of that drippy poop. But let's actually keep those dominant brush strokes. I kind of like where they're going. Some of them are raw and untouched, so they have these organic edges. And then some are actually hard edge shapes with brush fills. So we introduce a little of that digital smooth line for a subtle contrast. I mean, it's not being done super effectively because really I was a lot more focused on taking advantage of the inherent direction of these brush strokes to generate some kind of organized movement. Although I tried to break it up a little for variety, like here. The red color with all this smearing looked like blood, so I opted for a different color, and then I brought back this circle so there'd still be a sort of main hard-edged element in the center, with these secondary circles kind of echoing that main element. And very much like here, the contrast in scales between them kind of pulls the eye across them a bit, creating some diagonal movement. And then underneath it all, pushed into the background, is this more subtle brush texture, which is trying to help the background match the textural quality of all this other more dominant stuff. Originally, it was trying to do that, kind of like these smaller circles are, by echoing more dominant elements. Echoing is one of those strategies that's really useful, especially when we're talking so much about contrast in particular, because it's more about making secondary elements relate to a more dominant element by choosing some way to make them similar. Basically, a main element establishes, hey, I'm round and smooth and red, and everyone's paying attention to me. And then secondary elements go, well, I'm not red or smooth, but gosh darn it, I'm round. Or, well, I'm not round or smooth, but I'll be darned if I'm not red. You know, they can be different in certain respects and bear all kinds of contrast to each other, but still share some important quality so they feel like they belong together. Supporting elements that share some of these qualities with each other and some qualities with more dominant elements end up having a kind of harmony together. Relating the color, texture, line quality, whatever, can create a bit of a visual theme, which can help the overall composition feel more cohesive. It's even great for just kind of relating a few of your elements to each other, so they feel like they belong together as a group. Like, we got your back, bro. And, sometimes you want an element to be super visible and very apparent, to stick out, or even be the first read in the whole visual hierarchy. And sometimes you just want certain elements to not stick out so much. Like, tone it down, buddy. You're drawing a little too much attention to yourself. So originally, this brush stroke texture was trying to help the background feel somehow related to the central element with its downward dripping brush textures. But that dominant downward dripping element isn't there now, and the verticality of the background texture doesn't make as much sense anymore. Those brush strokes stand alone now. So just that simple verticality is enough to make them sort of different. So they're asking for a little too much attention without being important enough to need any attention. So instead of supporting more important elements, they end up fighting for some of the attention, but for no particular reason, which seems arbitrary and weird. Honestly, this stuff can be kind of subtle and hard to suss out. I didn't end up changing this until later because I just didn't recognize it, and it was one of the reasons I struggled a little. It's better if you are thinking about this stuff because it can have a real effect on how your composition works or doesn't work, especially when you've changed a more dominant element that other elements were relating to somehow because some of their qualities may not make so much sense anymore. So in this case, I was struggling, but it didn't seem like the basic composition had to change drastically. Although I did blindly bang around on it until eventually there were some happy accidents driving some real decisions. Like, I'm surprised I didn't see it earlier, and you've probably already considered this possibility, but I finally saw something emerging out of these leftover circles, and it was a space scene. I mean, you saw that, right? Clearly, I like space stuff, but I'm not the only one who saw that. I mean, it looks like a planet with moons and rings around it, so I intentionally pushed it in that direction. Redirected some of the brushwork, added in some of these spatters, and slammed the colors around until at one point I inverted it and went full on black and white. And as a result, it started reminding me of a comic book illustration. Now, it certainly didn't need to for our purposes, just like it didn't need to be a space scene. But I thought it was kind of cool as a means for driving some decisions. With that in mind, the quality of all these brush strokes feels more like a bunch of illustrated speed lines wrapping around the whole scene. Just a neat result that gave me some ideas, helped me develop some internal logic to work with. Like I thought, well, I should put some dot pattern into it, reminiscent of actual comic book printing. So I grabbed some of the background, crushed it, made it fully grayscale, then made it a bitmap with halftone settings, Then back to grayscale, little blurring, unsharp mask that puppy, slam it into the background, and done deal. And it's not cheating, get off my back. Just think about it as a million small circles. Also, it's a free country, I do what I want. Some lighting changes for depth to separate these planets from their background a bit, plus some finicky adjustments to the speed lines or planetary rings to simplify and help create more definite black and white shapes. Finally figured out that issue with the background texture's direction not working so well anymore. Pushed the whites to an ever so slightly warmer color, and that's pretty much it. It accomplishes that goal of using the handmade marks in a really prominent way. And that probably has a lot to do with it being a real departure from this other stuff, which is great. Now the challenge was to do 5. I sort of did 5.5. You know what? Nope, I did 5. And I was kind of tempted to keep going because there's just so much fertile ground here. You can make an infinite variety of marks with just simple tools at hand, and seeing how easily cool stuff comes out of those simple materials and how well it juxtaposes with the digital, it makes me want to grab a bunch of different kinds of markers and brushes, and sponges and spray paint and like powdered toners and whatever I can get a hold of and really go at it. Even with the constraints we're still working within, there's so many cool things you could end up with. One of the neat things about this is that you quickly generate these surprisingly valuable little things. And if you're paying attention, they can take you places you wouldn't have thought to go. Comic book speed lines or 80s nostalgia or dental office art. It's cool to be able to extract a tone or stumble upon a mood from a simple source of inspiration that only you have. And it's even cool to be able to introduce something organic and loose into something more planned. And these are all facets of the happy accident.
And see what happens. As you paint, you'll see all kind of things happening on your canvas, and very soon you learn to use all these beautiful little things that happen. We don't make mistakes. We have happy accidents.
And in this next round, appropriately enough, we're really going to explore the happy accident. And we're going to do that by focusing on using ready-made and even more randomly generated imagery. By that, I mean, on the one hand, we're going to pull some pre-made elements and use them in ways that are a little harder to control, just to see what comes out of it. And we're also going to make some stuff from scratch, but we're going to do it through slightly more chaotic processes for the same reason. And then we'll figure out how to find the magic in that stuff. It's a cool way to surprise yourself with what you make and get out of your own narrow tendencies. But it's even better as a way to develop a skill for actively forging a path through what you thought might have been a mistake or a disaster. Actively building that muscle for making something from nothing, which you can always strengthen no matter how buff you think you are. So far, we've been constrained to using the basic shapes for the bulk of our frames, but no more. All shapes, no shapes, dolphin shapes, free reign. Gonna get crazy up in this bitch.
Whoa, whoa. You know what I'm saying?
Our focus is on finding and using surprising stuff. So here are a few things to try to get some of those useful surprises in generally increasing order of randomness. First off, try making a vector style illustration, kind of like we did in the first couple rounds, but do it by cutting hard edge shapes out of construction paper. Lots of color, no color, high contrast, low contrast, whatever you like. And I only say construction paper specifically because it's got a little bit of heft. It comes in colors if you want, has visible texture, and you can get a pack of letter size sheets for like $2. I mean, use whatever kind of clean paper you like, but stuff with some heft is good in general. Use tissue or tracing paper for transparency if you want, or use thin cardboard if you want more thickness. Or other paper types for different textures. Slice them up, fold them up, layer them up, take a picture. You can keep it simple or get real crazy, and obviously you can get some crazy cool stuff just thinking about values, directions, the contrasts. But this is really just the low end of the randomness spectrum, so then find some scraps laying around and collage selected bits of them. Maybe incorporating some handmade marks like from last round. But mainly focus on found things, which might be parts of envelopes, junk mail, receipts, shopping lists, printed materials. Random stuff on the sidewalk is fantastic for this. Go for a few walks and look for stuff blown in by the wind. Really old stuff works well too if you can find it. Old books and banged up stuff. Or if that's all too dirty for you, look through your recycling for printed packaging or whatever you like. Just grab lots. It was trash before, you can always throw it away again. If some of the scraps have printed imagery, patterns, or are a little dirtied or textured in some way, those can be nice little points of interest. So keep your eye out for that. If there's text or typography, really try to look at it less as words and more as shapes, patterns, densities, textures. Look at it in terms of its visual qualities. It definitely doesn't have to mean anything. And you can put these together mostly digitally, or if you want to arrange some of it by hand, a tiny bit of double-sided tape or just enough of the old glue stick to get some tack will really help keep things from unintentionally sliding around too much without making them too difficult to move or replace. Once you've got enough of that raw material, if you want to try this, turn around and make some assemblies that are about 2 inches by 1 inch. You don't have to frame it in exactly, just make it small. You may have to get out an X-Acto knife and some tweezers and just completely give in to the idea that it's not going to be perfect. That's actually the point. You want some things to happen that you just can't control. And if nothing else, just blowing up really small stuff to full size with a scanner or a real camera setup and adding more stuff in post can be pretty cool. Crop in on some photos or printed imagery. Splice some old film together. They're tiny and they're fast to make, so it'll take a few to find some winning combos, but doing a few won't really take all that long. Or grab a magazine and find some images that have a recognizable silhouette. Cut them out as accurately as you can and scan your cutouts against a flat color you can key out in Photoshop or After Effects or whatever. So you've got that element, and then you can use the holes that are left over like stencils to sponge or brush ink through or spray paint or fling toner through. Or you can trace the photo or some part of it with pencil or pen or charcoal or brush or whatever you want. Use that result as an element, or use the stencil itself or composite parts of the original image back in. Or find an image of something recognizable like a face or a panda or a bag of Cheetos, then put your pencil to paper and draw it or part of it without looking at what you're doing. Just looking at the image, not what your hand is doing. Go as far as shading it blind if you think you're so good. Big shot! You'll have to try this a few times, but simple line drawings are usually the easiest to make and to work with, and they really don't take very long. Try pens, try markers, and try drawing without lifting your pen off the paper. Either way, you'll get something you would never get if you were making it pretty much any other way. And if you can, get some watercolor paper or even just some white cardboard. Get part of it wet and write your signature in ink on it. Watercolor brush or marker, calligraphy pen, whatever. It's not so much the signature specifically as it is making some definite strokes in ink and letting it bleed where it wants. I mean, draw a cat with pants on if that's what you're into, you weirdo. Or take some pliable paper, not tissue thin, but nothing heavy, lay it on a raised or engraved surface, and do a simple rubbing of it with soft pencil or charcoal. Yeah, just like Indiana Jones. But you don't have to go wading through flooded catacombs to raid historical sites. Anywhere you can find an actual engraving or like raised lettering works if you want some kind of legible imagery. Car emblems can be kind of cool. And any kind of rough surface will give you basic textural results too. Even something like weathered wood works. Really anything with some edges. You can get simple shapes or typography or organic messes. Go soft, go hard, whatever. Really just depends on what you want to use and what you can find. If you want to get a little bit messy, try some photo distressing. Find some old printed photos you don't care about or some kind of printed imagery like an unwanted record sleeve or something, and flick a little bleach on them bad boys. Drip it, brush it, splatter it, sponge it. It's unpredictable and it doesn't work as well for some kinds of printing. But if you tried any of the watercolor or ink bleed stuff, it'll tear through that pretty good. Careful with that stuff though, it'll also tear through the color on your pants. Now you want to get real messy and potentially real beautiful? Do some flip cups. Get some acrylic paints and some Floetrol at the art store or online. Just some small drink cups, some disposable stirrers of some kind, some flat surfaces like stiff cardboard or tile or wood or an actual canvas if you're fancy, and some gesso if you like. Squeeze 1 part paint, 4 parts Floetrol into a cup with maybe a few drops of water, and do this for each color in its own cup. Then get a fresh cup and pour in your color combo of choice, but don't stir it. Put your board on top, flip the whole thing over into your tray, and just lift the cup. Try adding some drops of vinegar or rubbing alcohol at this point if you like. If you prep your board by brushing a layer of gesso or some kind of primer, you'll also get different results. Do this a few times and take pictures of the results in diffuse lighting, and you got yourself something real to work with. We're making stuff in 2D for now, but for example, if you're more into 3D, you can see how cool this stuff can be once you really figure out how to use it. I mean, with any of these, you'll want to work with the outcomes because you're basically just making raw materials. In a real project, you might do some compositing, for example, to push these raw materials towards something that helps you get to your goal. So think about how to do that, because our focus is really to push that skill of identifying the value and utility of some less immediately obvious stuff, and to push our own visual libraries and image making capabilities into new territory. So we're really focused on looking at when these random processes produce things that we can use to create and manage contrasts in new ways. It's our same simple principles now applied in the wild. This is really going to be a challenge to assess the characteristics of these raw materials in these terms and use and accentuate those characteristics and details in our frames. And most likely to modify them and make them even more useful when combined with other stuff. You know, say you do work in 3D primarily. That's a great skill to develop, obviously, because frequently your rendered results are essentially unrefined raw materials that you need to be able to find treasure in or push as far as possible through compositing. And you certainly can include other techniques in this phase, but this collection is pretty great because each of these processes will make a different kind of unrefined mess, with the unpredictability generally increasing as you go down the list. And you'll want to try any given process quite a few times, but if you make enough messes and keep looking at them in these terms, you'll spot unexpectedly useful things coming out of it. Most likely you'll find a bunch of surprises. You may not know what to do with them at first, but this is where you figure it out. As before, and depending on which methods you choose, you can dictate most of the composition on paper and add or manipulate stuff in post. Or you can grab elements you find interesting from the results and arrange them in Photoshop or whatever you want to use. You might try doing a bit of both. The point in the end isn't just to make a mess, it's to find something beautiful or interesting or useful in the mess, and to make something from the mess. So really do look at these elements in terms of their details and qualities, and so how they might play into our usage of basic contrasts. You know, one element might complement another texturally, and you could work with their relative scales and orient them to indicate some direction together. They might also inherently bring some contrasting values to the table that you can manipulate and so forth. So maybe it's as simple as the way you frame an element or a set of elements by cropping, or in the formal relationships you create between them, or how you manipulate and abstract them with software. Most likely it's in all of those things. So really do as many randomizing experiments as you like. You know, you're not going to master something new right off the bat, obviously. That's clearly not how that works. So if you're trying something for the first time, keep it simple. Make some uncomplicated elements so you can test them out a bit. The bare minimum is 4 frames this time, really focusing on how to find surprising and usable aspects of what comes out of your tests. A couple of artists I think are particularly good at this are Augustine Kofi and Louise Mertens. Now, they're both formalists, but they both have really strong design influences and are typically using a combination of found materials and handmade elements. And of course, this isn't a suggestion of what you should be aiming for necessarily, but I think it's inspiring to see just how far it can be taken and how well it can be done. Augustine Kofi takes these found scraps and works them into these graffiti-inspired compositions on pressboard with marker and pencil and pen and acrylics using drafting techniques. I mean, I think this guy's amazing. There's a certain vibe going on here too, right? Little bits of typography and imagery. You know, the bits he's choosing are of this kind of American commercial nostalgia. And that stuff naturally brings with it certain colors and a certain kind of wear and tear that introduces specific textures. And he's paying enough attention to that to then deliberately bring in other complementary stuff like printed dot patterns and these thin line marker designs reminiscent of the 60s because they're aligned with that specific nostalgia. And then he echoes it with the kind of straight edge line work he's doing by hand. I think he does these almost entirely on large canvases. And then on the other end, Louise Mertens uses bits of fashion photography and adds ink or paint washes, and then photographs and digitally manipulates the results. And it turns out so beautiful. Whether or not she's distressing the photography itself, she's introducing this whole level of texture and color and line to it. She really works over the value and texture contrast in specific. Brights against darks and smooth surfaces next to broken or highly varied materials. Contrasting density, scale, it's all there. It's worth it just to sit and pick apart the imagery of artists like this, to figure out how and why it works. Even though this work is highly specific and idiosyncratic to these two artists, and you may not be inclined to make anything like this, we're working on the same playing field that they are now, with the same foundation and the same tools. We just have to figure out for ourselves what we want to do with all of it and find our way through some process to get to it. There's really a ton of artists we could talk about, obviously, and the potential outcomes of this challenge are incredibly varied at this point, even though we're still essentially trying to explore how basic visual contrasts work with all this stuff. At this stage, you and I might have been making more similar compositions, but now the variables are so numerous, it's becoming less a technical exercise and more a chance to discover some new aspects of your personal voice. So the experimenting part of this stuff is really valuable. Last chapter, I briefly mentioned making note of any mood or tone that's emerging while you work out each piece. You look at these together and hopefully you can see that this has a different tone than this. And that these went in the directions they did is really just a function of my tendencies and ways of thinking, of course. My voice. But it advances my voice into some territory it hadn't inhabited, which is great. You probably went in some other direction. And whether you feel like you know your voice well or not, part of the effort here is to both further define it and to push it out into some spaces we didn't know it could exist just yet. To take a crack at some discovery. It might be a subtle thing, but it becomes more and more valuable the more you develop it. It seems obvious that a lot of people get into design through having access to Photoshop or After Effects or a 3D app, some kind of software. And that's great because good tools are really empowering, and you can go a long way just using those tools. Now, every tool has its limits, of course, but the bigger issue is actually that everyone else has access to the same tools. In a lot of cases, if you can make something, 10 or 10,000 other people can make the exact same thing. And it's hard to differentiate yourself from the mob and define your value in that situation. And differentiating yourself is something you definitely want to do at some point. I've made this point before, but you don't want to be completely interchangeable with other artists as far as clients are concerned. Because if there's no distinguishing between you and someone else, they'll just pick whoever's cheapest. And you don't want to get into an arms race to be the cheapest. But more importantly, you probably also want to be doing your own work, as opposed to the same thing everyone else is doing. You want to make stuff according to your own taste, of course, which hopefully is part of why you're going through this exercise. Well, whether or not you end up falling in love with construction paper collages or blind contour drawings, these little experiments will, on the one hand, inevitably function as an exploration in both your taste and expanding your ability to make, and on the other hand, is a great platform for discovering how to see possibilities that other people never will. This is a fairly obvious example of that, I hope. I rarely dig out a brush and ink, and I'd forgotten it was so easy to make something I like so much. And what makes that possible is having practice in looking more deeply at seemingly mundane things and mistakes, to see them in terms of their qualities and then mine them for what's special. That skill alone, the ability to almost conjure happy accidents into existence, is maybe the single most valuable skill you could possibly cultivate. And it's definitely a cultivatable skill. Most people, honestly, do not walk around with their eyes open, soaking in the world. But as a creative person, that is your fuel. And the better you are at finding that fuel and using it, the more valuable you are across the board, and the more satisfying your own work can be. So we're kind of packing in a lot this round, exploring a few ways of making, furthering the ability to see value where others might not, and therefore mine more gold overall, and still working to understand all this stuff within the context of using the visual contrast to make consistently more beautiful things. On top of that, some of the imagery we'll be working with will inherently carry some meaning, and you may want to start taking that into account. You're probably not going to aim for anything explicit, like that someone would look at and say, "Oh, I totally get it." But you may choose certain elements to combine because they make sense thematically, for example. Or again, simply because they start creating a mood together. Now, hopefully that's energizing for you. But also, don't be surprised if you're feeling a little wiped out at this point. I am. Like we talked about, your brain may be getting challenged by kind of an onslaught of the unfamiliar. And sometimes it just takes some struggling to meet that challenge. I lagged pretty hard getting myself to sit down in front of actual materials and paper, even knowing full well why. And in the end, it was easy and resulted in surprises I really enjoyed. And if it's not a struggle for you, fantastic. Undoubtedly, I'll have to confront some of that again this round. And it may hit you too a bit. That's fine. That's how it works. Plow into it headlong. You're making progress when you're struggling. Now, we're only aiming for 4 finished compositions, and they can be really simple if you want. But it may still take you a while to really explore a few of these process suggestions, and then explore how to take advantage of the results. And when you start getting a little lost as to what you're meant to be doing with this mess, give yourself some boundaries to work with to keep things moving. Maybe make a portrait of someone or something, or make a splash screen for an app. Or give yourself some starter shapes and build a scene off of them. You can get some starter shapes pretty easily just by typing a short word onto your canvas in a bold weight. Or if that's too loose, give yourself some hard rules to work with, like constraining yourself to using just 3 elements, something like that. What's important at the start is to explore some of these processes, generate some elements, and get them on the page where you can identify their basic qualities. Color, texture, density, value, line quality, direction. Really think of them as collections of characteristics you might want to combine and contrast and highlight relationships between. And when they work or don't work, look to the same basic compositional underpinnings to figure out why. Is it a question of not enough variation in scale or value, or is one element indicating a direction that doesn't complement what other elements are doing? Can you manipulate your elements to make them work better together for any of those reasons? And I say this as a reminder not because you don't get it yet, but because there just may be a lot to focus on this round. And you may end up wandering down old paths just out of habit. I'm sure I will. There may also be questions of meaning coming into play if you're using recognizable imagery in some cases, especially if you're manipulating that imagery in one way or another. play with that meaning if you want, or manipulate and abstract the imagery so it's not so recognizable. No worries, it'll still work either way. So grab a few ideas from this list, or introduce your own brand of chaos. See what works and what doesn't. As always, 4 is really the bare minimum, so if you can make the time, do more than 4. Let yourself get wild, and then pick your favorites and just refine those. As with all these challenges, you can whip through it, but real progress is in the doing. So go that extra mile. I'm gonna go sit my butt down and try some stuff out. So get your stuff pulled together and get on it. See you soon.